I'd like to start by welcoming you all to ASHA's first event for 2025. I'm Helen Nicholson and I am the events coordinator for ASHA. Before we start, what I'd like to do is acknowledge that I'm coming from unceded lands of the Gadigal people, the Eora Nation, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, as well as any First Nations people who are zooming in for our fabulous talk tonight. We are very, very lucky to have Associate Professor Jon Prangnell speaking to us. Jon retired from the University of Queensland School of Social Sciences after almost 4 decades. Not only was he a beloved and award-winning teacher and supervisor, Jon also had a very long career in historical archaeology, cultural heritage, research and archaeological consultancy. And in 2013 was awarded the Governor's Silver Heritage Award by the National Trust. He was president of the Australasian Society for Historical Archaeology from 2010 to 2013, deputy head of school at UQ, and co-edited 5 volumes of the Australasian Historical Archaeology Journal. When I looked at his UQ bio, he had actually produced 100 reports, articles, papers, as well as publishing 2 books. I've since found out that he actually produced 300. So not only has he spent a long time at UQ, he has also produced an enormous amount of work that was knowledge-based and researched and on archaeology in Queensland. In 1991, Jon's honours thesis was on the 1828 convict-built Tower Mill in Brisbane, using something that was really out there and very new technology at the time, ground-penetrating radar. There is a YouTube recording of Jon's 2010 National Archaeology Week talk that discusses this, and I'll put that in the chat. He has also led large-scale excavations at the North Brisbane Burial Ground and now home to Suncorp Stadium. Jon's 1999 PhD, entitled Intended Solely for Their Greater Comfort and Happiness, Historical Archaeology, Paternalism and the Peel Island Lazaret. Both his honours and PhD thesis were the first historical archaeology theses to be completed at the University of Queensland. Quite groundbreaking. The Peel Island Lazaret housed Hansen disease patients between 1907 and 1959. And it is this that Jon revisits tonight as he reflects on the way changes in historical archaeological practice and thought would have improved his project. Jon has an encyclopedic knowledge and understanding of 19th and 20th century Queensland heritage and archaeology, and continues to research the development of capitalist social relations in colonial and post-colonial Queensland. Over 4 decades, he has touched the lives of countless undergraduate, honours and PhD students who have gone on to have very, very successful careers in archaeology, heritage and beyond. Pretty well anybody working in Queensland has either been taught by or supervised by Jon. Now in his retirement, which is not really retirement, what Jon enjoys most of all is mucking around with his 3-year-old granddaughter, Heidi. So thank you for agreeing to talk to us tonight, Jon. It's over to you.
Well, thank you, Helen, and thank you to all the audience for coming along to this. I hear that it's quite a large audience that have joined us from all over the world. So thank you very much for coming along. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of all the lands that we're all meeting here from across Australia and across the world, and to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. As you can see, there are a couple of warnings on this front slide. One is that racist language is used in historical context in this presentation, and that's mostly the use of the term coloured to mean non-white people and the use of the term black. It's really hard to avoid these terms when talking about the Lazaret, as that was the name coloured was used continually throughout the documentation, and coloured compound was the name of one of the sections of the Lazaret. In fact, there was a number of names for that section, and that's the least racist. There's also a historic image of now deceased Aboriginal men from North Stradbroke Island within this presentation. I'm going to do a bit of a YouTube thing here now and say, if you hold on to the very end of this video, there's a surprise for you, and that's a photo of my granddaughter, which I've put on the end there, so for those that hang around to the very end. So the photo of me on the front of this, on this title page, is a photo that I published in 2013 in an article in the journal Historical Archaeology. It's a photo of me revisiting Peel Island about 15 years ago. And I revisited it a few times because a local TAFE college on the mainland opposite Peel Island runs a cultural heritage course. And I used to help them out by taking their students to Peel Island and talking about heritage issues on the island with them. And I'm standing there beside a pineapple carved on a fence post. And this was beside one of the churches on the island. And I'll show you some more pictures of that a bit later on. But when I published this in the SHA journal, I put the caption on it something like "The Author and the Pineapple." And I really, really wanted to put on a sub-caption saying "The author's on the right," but the editors wouldn't go for that. Okay, so let's talk about Peel Island. For those of you that live in southeast Queensland, and when I look through the people that are here, there are quite a number of you, hi Mark, you'll be familiar with this kind of image. This is one of the cyclone trackings for the Cyclone Alfred that just crossed the coast a couple of weeks ago. And I was looking at images like this for, half a dozen times a day for a couple of weeks. So I thought if other people had done that, then this would be easy to place Peel Island for you. Can you see my cursor? Does somebody nod? Yeah, beauty. Okay, so this is Moreton Island. This is North Stradbroke Island. Brisbane's inland a bit here. And Peel Island is right here above the P of 10 p.m. on March the 7th. This is a more standard image. This is Peel Island here. This is North Stradbroke Island. Dunwich is the main town on North Stradbroke Island, directly beside Peel, and Cleveland's over here. This is a recent Google Earth image of Peel Island. I'm going to start by explaining some of the characteristics of the island. You can see the Lazaret here in the northwest corner of the island. We'll zoom in on that a bit later on. Coming down this side, this is actually the edge of the island here. This is mangrove, mudflat mangrove. This is the edge of the actual land. Here, this used to be a jetty that ran all the way out to here, out to the deep water, and this was the way that we accessed the island when we worked on the island. The jetty actually burnt down about, I don't know, a decade and a half ago, when some young people decided to camp on the end of the jetty and had a campfire on a 100-year-old wooden jetty. So the jetty's not there anymore. If you come around here, this area here is Horseshoe Bay, and it's well beloved by boaties in Moreton Bay. Here's an image of a whole lot of boats in Horseshoe Bay. This bit here is called the Bluff. That's this bit here. As you come round, this is Cucumber Point. This was nicknamed by patients at the Lazaret as Lover's Point because people would apparently sneak off up there. There's a tiny little bit of dry land after you get through all this mangrove. This is the Lazaret gutter, and this apparently is really good fishing in here. And these pale areas in here are swamps. And this swamp was the major water supply for the Lazaret in this top corner here. And this is a close-up of that same photo showing the Lazaret. Mostly what it shows is the most recent buildings. So the Lazaret was divided into a number of areas. We had what was called the sort of administrative area here. This was the superintendent's house, the matron's house, the nurse's quarters, and there was a male attendant's quarters here, but it's no longer there. This is the doctor's residence. The Lazaret opened in 1907, but the first doctor was appointed in 1949. So although it was supposedly a hospital, there wasn't actually a doctor. The doctor from the Benevolent Asylum at Dunwich would come over occasionally. This is a recreation hall that was put in there in 1947, and these are some of the patients' huts that you can see here. These are more modern national parks buildings because the island is now co-managed by national parks and the traditional owners. So, why was there a Lazaret on Peel Island? I've lost control of myself. There we go. The Lazaret housed people with leprosy. And I'll use the term leprosy and Hansen's disease interchangeably throughout this talk because they're the same thing. And I'll just forget where I am and use them interchangeably. So it's caused by the Mycobacterium leprae, which invades nerve cells. And it's an organism similar to the one that is responsible for causing tuberculosis. In fact, they're very closely related. But unlike tuberculosis, Hansen's disease is not particularly contagious. In fact, it's really, really hard to catch. Unlike the sort of common perceptions of leprosy, where it's simple to catch and it's devastating to get. In fact, it's really, really hard to catch it. And most people who get it never know they had it. They get a subclinical form of the infection, so there are no signs or symptoms. They don't know. It's only in testing afterwards that you find out that you had leprosy. So on this slide here, I've got the first diagnoses of people in Queensland. A Chinese person in 1855, the first South Sea Islander in 1862. The South Sea Islander was a shepherd working, I think, on the Darling Downs, was eventually admitted to the Brisbane General Hospital and was diagnosed with a thing called Islander's toe disease, which was later redefined as leprosy. The first European-born person in Queensland was in 1868, and that was a wardsman at the Brisbane General Hospital. And then in 1891, this is what caused a massive stir in Queensland, was that the first native-born non-Aboriginal person caught the disease or was diagnosed with the disease. This was a young 19-year-old man in Rockhampton who'd lived his entire 19 years in Rockhampton. I won't be using any patients' names during this presentation. I had approval to access all the patient records from the Lazaret, from the Minister for Health, but one of the conditions was that I never, ever named any of the people, which causes quite some concern for family historians who would like to know that information. Apparently those records will become publicly available in 2059, but I don't suppose I'll be around to see that. The first Aboriginal person was diagnosed in 1892, and I suspect that's not because the first Aboriginal person to catch leprosy caught it in 1892. I suspect that that was a lack of medical attention and concern. But our young man from Rockhampton caused a whole lot of publicity, caused a whole lot of concern in Parliament, and very quickly the Leprosy Act was passed in 1892. And the Leprosy Act allowed the government to make anywhere that there was a person with leprosy a lazaret. So they could isolate that person, put them wherever they wanted, and designate that place a lazaret, which meant nobody else could go in there. So the very first lazaret in Queensland was actually before that act. It was in 1889, a lazaret was established on Damon Island in the Torres Strait. So this is Cape York. These are some of the islands of Torres Strait. This is Damon Island. It's so small on my Google image, it didn't even come up with a name. But it was mostly uninhabitable and no facilities were made. So people were just basically dumped on the island. By 1892, when it was abandoned, 16 patients had been sent there. 13 of those had died of bronchial infections and 2 had committed suicide. So only 1 survived the Damon Island lazaret. It was closed when that new legislation created lazarets. And the lazaret that was created here was on Friday Island. So most people have heard of Thursday Island in the Torres Strait. Friday Islands, you know, the next day. So you go Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. So lazaret was established on Friday Island. This was for anybody who was designated as coloured, as not white. A lazaret for white people was established on Stradbroke Island. And Adams Beach. So this is an aerial of Dunwich on Stradbroke Island, and there was a benevolent asylum on Stradbroke at Dunwich. The benevolent asylum was set up basically for if you were arrested for being a vagrant, for having no means of support, for living on the streets basically, for being homeless, you were sent to the Dunwich Benevolent Asylum until somebody claimed you. So people live there in large parts of their lives in the benevolent asylum. There's not much of it left. This building with the red roof is the dining hall of that benevolent asylum, and it's sort of stretched out over most of this current area of Dunwich. This was the cemetery up here. So Adams Beach, where the lazaret was established, was just here on the other side of the point. So that was established in November 1892, and our young man from Rockhampton was brought down. He was the first patient in this lazaret. He was brought down in a small open boat that was towed from Rockhampton to Brisbane behind the government steamer, the QGS Otter. And he wasn't the last to be transported in those kind of conditions. Like, people with Hansen's disease were isolated even in terms of transporting them to the lazarets. By March 1906, there were in fact 14 coloured patients housed in tents at the Adams Beach lazaret in anticipation of the development of a new multiracial lazaret on Peel Island. Although, you know, things with the government and public service, I guess, are always mixed up. An Aboriginal man from the Myora Mission, which is literally a kilometre up the road, was sent to Friday Island Lazaret, even though there were Aboriginal people at the Adams Beach Lazaret. And then a year later was sent back to the newly created Peel Island Lazaret. Okay, so from 1905 onwards, I've got a picture of the Benevolent Asylum for you. I forgot about that. Okay. From 1905 onwards, a new location for a multiracial lazaret was sought near Brisbane, and the rationale was basically financial. They worked out that it cost too much to provide fresh meat, canned meat, and bread to both Brisbane, to the island, and to the Torres Strait. So in the end, they decided to construct one lazaret on Peel Island. As you can imagine, it didn't meet with universal approval, just as the announcement today by the Premier of a new stadium in Victoria Park hasn't met with universal approval. The Cleveland community roundly objected to the proposal, with petitions being sent to Parliament, and the White Hansen's disease patients on Stradbroke were also opposed to the move. They wrote to the Home Secretary saying, "We, the undersigned inmates of the Lazaret, having heard that it's the intention of the government to shift us to some other place, respectfully beg to be allowed to remain here. We consider this place to be fairly healthy with a fine view, and we've made a kind of a home of it. The only drawback is the presence of so many black lepers camped in front of us and near our veranda, so if the blacks were removed, we'd be more reconciled to our unfortunate fate." So when the new multiracial lazaret was opened on Peel Island in July 1907, the existing lazarets at Dunwich and Friday Island were closed and all the patients were transferred. 31 patients came from Friday Island in a special wooden house built on the deck of the Otter. So what you can see here, this is a photo from the Queenslander newspaper in 1932. What you can see here is in the centre area here is the administration, the superintendent, the matron, the nurses, the male attendants. The white female patients are here. The white male patients are here. This is the cook's house. This is the male dining rooms. This is the church that I mentioned earlier. This is the surgery. And this is what was called the coloured compound. From 70 patients, of which 51 were coloured. The decline in numbers that you can see here, so I'll just say the black line is the total number of patients. The red line is the number of coloured patients. I didn't put in a line for the others because it's subsumed within the total. So we opened with 70 patients. The decline in numbers from 1911 here is directly attributable to the termination of the indentured labour program in 1906 and the forced repatriation of large numbers of South Sea Islanders. Because originally the vast majority of coloured patients at the Lazaret were South Sea Islanders. White inmates outnumbered the coloured inmates, and they were called inmates and not until about 1930 when the term changed to patients. The white inmates outnumbered the coloured inmates for the first time in 1919, and by 1930 all coloured patients were Aboriginal. Patient numbers steadily increased until 1940, when all the coloured patients were moved to a lazaret built on Phantom Island in the Palm Island group in central Queensland. So over the time, there was a total of 572 admissions. I don't know what just happened. Jesus. 572 admissions, including readmissions. 250 patients died at the Lazaret, and there was a cemetery to the east of the Lazaret. And of course, health department policy was that anything that went onto the island stayed on the island. So if you died on the island, you were buried on the island. No one's ever found the burial records, and I don't even know if there was a burial record as such. Okay. So just point out the different compounds again. So this is the white male compound, also known as the male compound, also known as number 1 camp. The female compound or women's compound, and then what was known as the coloured compound, blacks compound, or even worse, blacks camp, and worse names. I've got 2 screens going. I'm getting confused. So, huts in the 2 white patient compounds were initially constructed at a cost of £55 each and were made of weatherboard and fibro on hardwood stumps. And from 1908, the huts were built with awnings and patients individualised them by forming enclosed verandas. I'll just say the huts in the women's compound were bigger than the huts in the men's compound, and that's because the women had a stove in their hut because they were actually expected to cook their own meals, whereas the men had a cook and ate in dining rooms. The coloured patients' huts were constructed at a cost of £3 each by Aboriginal labour from Baramba and Myora. Each hut was made from a timber frame cut from trees on the island, lined with rough-hewn slabs and roofed with tea tree bark. They had bare earth floors. These huts measured 10 foot by 12 foot and were supposed to house 2 people. There are no health department plans or works department plans for these huts, and no works department materials were used in their construction. And the Government Architect's Office estimate for the cost of constructing the Lazaret included no amount at all for anything in the coloured compound. The Lazaret opened with 16 of these, I'm going to call them humpies, to house 51 patients. Tents were used to house the overflow, and in 1909 these huts were upgraded, using inverted commas, by cladding them in corrugated iron.
US fighter jets take off from the Red Sea.
Sorry, I can't hear. Somebody's talking to me.
Houthis. 2 days of
Keep going, John. Sorry.
A dozen high-ranking,
Keep
Okay.
going, John.
including vice.
Okay, so
Security advisor.
it's not me, is it? I'm not stuffing it up.
No, it's not you.
Okay, so
The message.
it's like every time I start to talk. So the huts were upgraded by cladding them in corrugated iron. And you can see here, these corrugated iron huts. And this little wooden building here is the morgue. And a year later, so the floors were concreted using shell from the 2,000-year-old middens just near the Lazaret. That's a close-up of one of those huts in that previous image, that one there. Just showing that they literally were just clad in corrugated iron and the window and the door were just holes. There was no cover over them. And this upgrade was only done after serious consideration was given to the proposal that coloured patients only ever be housed in temporary bush shelters so that they could be periodically burnt down and reconstructed. That option was only ruled out when they actually worked out that would be more expensive than cladding and concreting. In 1908, the coloured patients built an Anglican church just north of their compound, which became known as the Church of the Good Samaritan. And it was constructed from second-hand materials salvaged from the demolished Lazaret at Dunwich. And there was a second church on the island. This was the Catholic Church. It was a patient's hut. It became the Catholic Church in the 1950s, and Father Gabriel Nolan visited once a month to conduct Mass and hear confessions. I didn't have a historic photo of the Catholic Church. So when the Lazaret was established, there was no known treatment for Hansen's disease. The drug guaiacol was used from the start. It's an organic compound that's not used medically anymore. It's now used to flavour roasted coffee and whiskey. It's what gives it that smoky flavour, assuming that, it hasn't been put through peat or whatever. But I'd watch out for guaiacol if you're a whiskey drinker, but maybe you'll never get leprosy, who knows. There were also early experiments with a drug called Nastin, and there's a lot of talk around 1910, 1911 in journals like the Lancet about pro and anti the use of Nastin. It was actually made from the causative mycobacterium, and people were injected with the leprosy mycobacterium. It led to patient revolt on the island and claims by patients of deaths at the Lazaret. The major medication used throughout the history of the Lazaret, though, was chalmugra oil. It was used from 1910 onwards when Bayer introduced this drug here called anti-leprol. It's made from the fruit of the chalmugra tree, and they use it in conjunction with guaiacol, and it can be either injected or taken orally, which I guess tells you about how effective it was. But either way, it was extremely unpleasant to take, and it had inconsistent results, although apparently remissions did occur. And it remained the standard treatment until the introduction of sulfonamide drugs in the late 1940s. And they planted trees at Cairns and Townsville so that they could obtain the oil for the Lazaret. In 1940, when the coloured patients compound was closed down and all the patients were moved to Phantom, the white patients then applied to the health department and were granted permission to use the huts from the coloured compound as animal pens. The department disinfected the huts for 4 days and then moved them to the white compound to house goats and chickens. The Lazaret closed in 1959, and the introduction of sulfonamide drugs led to a rapid decline in the Lazaret's population. And this is one of the last photos taken at the Lazaret. This is looking across the white male compound. This is the cook's house here, the recreation hall from 47. This is the hospital building, which was built at the end of the 1940s. The dining room's gone, it burnt down in the 1940s. And it shows you how open it is about the views across Moreton Bay that you could get from the Lazaret. So that's the Lazaret. Now I'm going to turn to my research questions and how I went about doing my PhD. So I had 6 research questions, and I don't intend to go through them all because there were 6 of them. So I'm just going to concentrate on what I considered to be the most important research question that I had. This is what my thesis was about. I wanted to know what were the characteristics of the paternalism and disciplinary power as expressed at the Lazaret. So to do that, I needed to develop a definition of paternalism that would be accessible archaeologically. And this is the definition that I used. I actually mashed a couple of definitions together from different people. So I defined it as a set of behaviours that culminates in the exercise of freedom, diminishing control by one person over another, justified by reasons referring to the welfare, good, happiness, needs, interests, or values, I've made a typo there, of the person being coerced. So basically, we're going to send you to an island, we're going to restrict what you can do, we're going to treat you like crap, and it's for your own good. That's my definition. But to get at that, I needed to understand the characteristics of paternalism. So I took this basically from the work of Scranton, who worked on paternalism, Irving Goffman's work on total institutions, and of course Foucault's work on disciplinary power. And if anybody, there's a number of people there in the audience who know me, they will know my love of Foucault. So, yeah. So these are the characteristics that I identified as being part of a whole paternalistic endeavour. So content relates to the socio-political, economic and religious context in which the paternalism occurs. Content relates to the physical and moral components of paternalism. So I subdivided content into three different areas: provision, protection, and control. And provision is the stuff provided by the paternalist, things like the accommodation, medical care, food, wages, whatever. Protection involves the paternalist being responsible for the moral health of their charges, which might include things like controlling access to alcohol and policing religious or sexual behaviours. And then control follows from the institutionalisation of these practices and the application of disciplinary power. So you can see this is where Foucault's coming in. So I took 5 of those Foucaultian concepts, being spatialisation, which involves the use of space so that everyone knows their place within that space. The minute control of activity and the repetitive exercises lead to routine repetitive behaviours that are subject to codifiable rules, accessible to surveillance, and punishable if they're broken. Detailed hierarchies relates to the complex chains of authorities that exist within institutions, and particularly in this time period, often identifiable by the number of keys somebody carried. And then the normative judgment relates to the way disciplinary power normalises. It defines normal and therefore it defines abnormal. For instance, a patient at the Lazaret had to prove they were normal to be released. They had to prove that they were disease-free. And they had to prove that for 24 months. So every patient was swabbed every month to test for the mycobacterium. And you had to have 24 clear swabs before you could leave the island. So you can just imagine the kind of power dynamics that occurred when you'd had 21 or 22 or 23 clear swabs and you were so close to being discharged, and you had the dynamics going on that would normally go on in an institution and that we've had, numerous royal commissions about. And then finally, the third of the main characteristics is affect. And this is the emotional component of paternalism. The emotional and psychological bonds that exist between the paternalists and the objects of that paternalism. And just as an aside, this caused me all kinds of problems when one of my examiners misunderstood the term affect and thought it related to the effects of paternalism. And I thought I'd explained it really well in my thesis, but when I reread it over the weekend, I realised that maybe I hadn't explained it as well as I could have. So, this is what I'm looking for when I'm doing my research. I'm trying to answer that question about paternalism, and these are the characteristics of paternalism that I'm trying to identify and understand at the Lazaret. I don't intend to talk about the methodology that I used because it was quite complex and it's probably out of space, out of thing here. But I used a methodology called middle-range theory as hermeneutics. And this is because of the time period I was doing my thesis in and the sort of context within which my thesis was occurring. As Helen said earlier, this was the first PhD in historical archaeology at the University of Queensland. My supervisors were all prehistorians. My supervisors were all processualists. I was writing a post-processual historical archaeology. So I had to do a whole lot of justifying in my PhD. I had to justify doing historical archaeology. I had to justify doing post-processualism. I had to justify all kinds of different aspects. And Picasso developed this methodology. He was a philosopher of science, particularly interested in archaeology and history. And I do like this. This was a little quote from him that's really not to do with the methodology. I just like it. Some of what we claim about to know about the past is true, the rest is false. And what he was really interested in doing was trying to strengthen that our relationship with the past, strengthen our interpretations of the past so that more of what we said about it was true. And his sort of analysis of middle range theory was that, in fact, it was a type of hermeneutic circle. So this was the methodology that I used. I think I used it quite successfully, but I used it specifically because I had processualists using middle range theory as supervisors. And so it was a kind of way to appease them, let's say. Okay, so the methods I used are pretty standard historical archaeology methods, except in one specific case, which I'll talk about in a sec. So looked at primary sources, secondary sources, did surveys, did excavations. The main primary sources were work department files, and I'm not giving primacy to the documents here. What I'm doing is talking about them so I can get them out of the way. So the work department files contain patient letters, compound and building plans and specs, work orders, financial statements, internal memos, things like that. The Health and Home Affairs Department files contain the patient records that I mentioned earlier, and the Health Secretary files contained Lazaret correspondence, material concerned with Lazaret management, and files that they called Lazaret control files. There were a number of eyewitness accounts have been collected and written about the Lazaret. Paul Ludlow, an amateur historian, and a group called the Friends of Peel Island have collected stories about the place. There have been first-hand accounts written. Rosemary Apala, a former nurse on the island, has written a history of it. June Bertelson, a former patient, has published a book about her experiences on the island, and Morgan Gabriel, the last medical superintendent, has published articles about the Peel Island Lazaret. So they were the sort of documents that I was using to in that methodological approach. So the first thing I did was to do a survey of the island. So this was designed primarily to locate and describe the distribution of Lazaret materials across the island and to see if there was anywhere outside the Lazaret that was worth excavating. I used an interval transect strategy, the transects running magnetic north-south, and they were placed 200 metres apart east-west. And at 100-metre intervals along each transect, we cleared 4 square metres of leaf litter, and at each of those quadrats we recorded any artefacts, and we probed for subsurface materials. I did this work with traditional owners from Stradbroke Island. So we found Lazaret materials up to 1.4 kilometres from the Lazaret. So the Lazaret's up in this northwest corner, and we found materials spread out across the island. And these kind of materials included bottle glass, tin cans, fragments of clocks, and a kerosene lamp. But you'll see here that we also found a few other things. We found a weather balloon that had landed on here at some point in the past. I found a large scarred tree up on this northern edge. These black squares here are all shell-midden material. And we found a horse skeleton. This horse skeleton had a bullet hole through its skull, and I know that this is a horse named Podge. The Lazaret had a number of horses, and when they left in 1959, they left one horse on the island. They left Podge on the island. Don't know why they left Podge on the island, but in 1962, Podge was shot by a Redland Shire Council caretaker because it was apparently starving to death. So and we found the skeleton, which I was really pleased with. So in this survey, we also found a series of dumps, which I've called 1, 2, 3, and 4. Dump 4 was architectural material from the Lazaret. Obviously, after the Lazaret closed, it started to deteriorate quite badly, and at different times, building materials have been dragged away and dumped there. Dump 3 looked like a one-off dumping at the closing of the Lazaret. Materials were brought down here to go off the island at the jetty, and this is a truck that looks like it was driven into the bush with whatever was on it and it just left there when they left. Dump 2 was medical materials from the hospital, you know, stuff related to the swabs, like the microscope slides and things like that. And dump 1 was consumables and bottles, things like that. So I actually targeted dump 1 for excavation. So this is what the Lazaret looked like when I arrived. It was run by National Parks at that time. The traditional owners hadn't won their native title claim. This was, you know, in the early 90s. And they'd been boarding up some of the huts to weatherproof them, but not all of them. This is in the white female patient's compound. This is an individual hut. This is an individual hut. This is the bathhouse. And I excavated this site here, this one here, the demolished one here. This was the hut that June Bertelsen, the person who published a book on their accounts, this is the hut that she was in. I guess as an aside, all the rows between the huts had names. This one was Quality Row. This was one of the coloured patients' huts that wasn't turned into an animal pen. That was still in its original location. There's another one. This is a shot of the cemetery. This is the pineapple without the author. So around the church, there were a number of fence posts that had things like pineapples, kangaroos. There was a fish, and as far as I know, the only church in Christendom with a penis on a fence post. And it's quite a large penis. That scale on there is 30 centimetres across. Okay, so from those surveys, created this plan of the Lazaret. It's the extant buildings that related to the Lazaret, except I've also put on the church and the male attendants' quarters, just for clarification, particularly since I decided to excavate the male attendants' quarters. So I excavated 5 areas. Dump 1, which was off the side here, Site 80, which was June Bertelsen's hut, Building 71, which was the male attendants' quarters, Hut 39, which was this one here, and Hut 34, which was this one here. These numbers come from the Works Department when the Lazaret was cleared and everybody left. The Works Department went in and inventoried everything and gave all the buildings numbers. So I just used those numbers. So these were the 5 sites I excavated. These are the size of each of the excavations. So in the dump, 6 square metres, in site 34, 3, you can see the numbers there. And then these are the number of artefacts that I got out of each of those. So you can see that, say, site 34 in 3 square metres, I pulled out almost 12,000 artefacts. And this is because nothing left the island. Nothing left the Lazaret. Things that could be burnt got burnt in the incinerator, but other things were just thrown away. They were just dropped, thrown away, thrown under huts, whatever. So almost at least 50% of that, 118,000 artefacts, is bottle glass. So a huge number of artefacts. And if you look at that, 118,000 artefacts in 19.5 square metres gives us an average of 6,055 artefacts per square metre. So one of the things that I did think about, would I change now if I did it now? And because I was supervised by prehistorians, I dug really small holes. You can see I only opened up 2.5 metres at a hut. You know, these days I'd go in there thinking, oh, I've got a large open area excavation and I'll get the whole hut. I'm really, really glad I didn't. I'm probably still be analysing the artefacts now. You know, this explains why it took me 7 years to do my thesis. Okay. So they were the excavation numbers. I've just got some pickies of some of the excavations here. So we ran classes for students in the field classes, field schools. We ran field schools for undergraduate students there, and this is the recreation hall that's built at that northern end of the Lazaret, and that's what we used as our base, and people camped in there. And this is us setting up there. So we excavated a number of the sites as field schools. So at some of these field schools, I thought some people might recognise some of these famous Australian archaeologists who, as undergrads, were excavating on Peel Island. This is Professor Christopher Clarkson, one of the world's leading lithics and analysts. This is distinguished Professor Sean On from James Cook University, one of Australia's leading prehistorians. This is Dr. Garrick Hitchcock, anthropologist at ANU. This is Dr. Melissa Carter. I lost track of where Melissa's at. And this is someone named Caitlin, who I cannot possibly remember anything else about. So if anybody knows anything about Caitlin, put it in the chat, please. I'm really pleased that I even remembered it was Caitlin. So, yeah, some people who know me will be surprised by that too. So, moving on. This is excavating the male attendants' quarters. It was completely demolished. And so that's why I chose to excavate that one, all the staff quarters. You can see the age of how old this is, not just because we're using a dumpy as our machine here, but because this is me. And you can see the colour and amount of hair I've got on my head and beard. This is site 80. Again, this is June Bertelson's hut. This is the bathhouse across the way. I decided to excavate this one because of the book, and two, because it was demolished. And this one was actually demolished following the closing of the Lazaret. In the early 1960s, the government called for tenders to remove all the buildings at the Lazaret. And a guy named Sorowski won the tender. And he demolished a number of buildings, loaded all the material onto a truck, put nameplates on buildings that he demolished for some reason. I mean, no one else was going to come and take the stuff, but he put these nameplates on them, drove his truck down to the jetty, loaded all his stuff onto his bar, all this stuff onto the barge to take it away for salvage, overloaded the barge, overturned the barge, it washed into the mangroves, and it's still there. If you actually enter the island at that point, you can see the barge is just there. So that was why we have any structures at all at the Lazaret, was because he overloaded his barge on the very first trip. And so he never came back to the island. So this was excavating at site 80. You can see here, this scale here is 25 centimetres. So you can see that the excavations weren't very deep. Lots of tree roots. And this is a 1980s garbage dump, a hole. In the 1980s, the Brisbane, the Church of England Grammar School, otherwise known as Churchy, got permission to run science camps on the island, and they used to take their students over to the island, and obviously they buried their rubbish, because when I excavated this, I actually found a churchy sock in this pit. So I know that this is a churchy pit. This is site 34. So this is the one that I got the 12,000 artefacts out of, this size excavation. And you can see the artefacts in the wall here. It's just, you scratch the surface and it's just chocker with artefacts. And this was site 39. And one of my favourite artefacts from the excavation was this cutthroat razor. We know from the records that the only person that lived in Hut 39 for the entire time was a guy that was completely blind. And then at his hut, we find a cutthroat razor. And I'm just thinking, yeah, okay, that might be a little bit dangerous. And this is the site of dump one. You can see, so this is the edge of the mangroves here. This is the edge of the island of where the Lazaret is, and you can see all these green alcohol bottles, general purpose green alcohol bottles all over the surface here. Okay, and we put in 6 square metres in 2 lines up that slope. I did want to go further, but I started to feel it was too dangerous with this sort of cliff of glass hanging over the top of us. And as you can see, we got, I think it was 80,000 artefacts out of those 6 square metres there. And this was my favourite artefact at the entire Lazaret. So this is a bath thermometer that we found. And you can see on this side it's got degrees in Fahrenheit, but on this side it's got temperatures for baths. So we've got a cool bath, a temperate bath, a tepid bath, a warm bath, and a hot bath. It just really appealed to me. So, some of the results. The universe of artefacts unearthed at the Lazaret indicates the plainness, sameness, and conformity of the material culture component of the everyday lives at the Lazaret. Provisions were basic, tableware was plain, and it was marked with the Queensland government crest. So everything you ate of, everything you drank out of, your cutlery, it was all marked as being owned by the Queensland government. There was little or no choice in foods, beverages, or condiments. There was a distinct lack of personal items, although there were bits of clocks and there was parts of crystal radio sets. But both of those things were provided by the government. Obviously, the control of space was a major factor of life at the Lazaret. Boundaries existed at the island, at the Lazaret, at the compound, and at the hut level, and the spatial arrangement of the place meant that patients could be observed at all times. So in terms of thinking about how I do things differently, my initial thought was around the excavation. It was around, historical archaeologists don't excavate in 50 centimetre by 1 metre long trenches. But looking back on it, I think 180,000 artifacts is more than enough. So I would probably start out thinking that I'm going to do large open area excavations, but I think it would be very quickly, it would get narrowed down to the kind of excavation that I did anyway, just because of the sheer volume of material that was being found. I think also we didn't excavate in the coloured patients compound because the traditional owners didn't want us to. They asked me not to, so I didn't. But I think that it would be a really good thing to do, to be able to make comparisons with the way coloured patients live their lives at the Lazaret compared to the others. I mean, one of the things we found was that the white male patients and the male attendants, so the lowest ranked staff members at the Lazaret, lived more similarly than the white male patients and the white female patients. So it would be really interesting to see what other comparisons existed at the Lazaret. But obviously, I wouldn't even contemplate doing that without traditional owner approval and involvement in that process. Okay. I've called the next thing rationale. And that's because throughout my thesis, I had to justify doing historical archaeology. And I had to justify examining the 20th century. And I had to justify using a post-processual approach. And I had to justify using functional categories. I mean, Mary's paper on functional categories was, a decade and a half in the future. So, but now I don't need to do these things. The discipline has matured. The discipline has come so far that none of these things are necessary anymore. Nobody needs to justify doing historical archaeology, and nobody needs to justify looking at the 20th century. I mean, there's a whole contemporary, archaeology where you look at the present. One would suggest you even look at the future. So the fact that I wouldn't need to justify these things would free up so much space in the thesis, and it would allow me, I think, to be more creative. Because one of the things when I reread the thesis on the weekend, one of the things that I thought was that my discussion chapter was pretty basic, that I didn't push the data as far as I could have. And I think that's part of being a PhD student. And I think it was, in part also because of the kind of supervision I had, where I wasn't supervised by historical archaeologists telling me to push the data, push the interpretation of the data. Okay. I think my research questions would pretty much stay the same. That interest in paternalism, that interest in health, comes from my own background. I worked a number of years in mental health. I was a mental health nurse for over a decade, and I was a union representative, what if it was an industry rather than a hospital would have been called a shop steward for the same union that represented the male attendants on Peel Island. So I had the same interests in the way the government ran its institutions and the paternalism of those institutions. I think my theoretical approach would stay the same. Obviously, I'd still use Foucault. Nothing's going to ever change that. I'll die as a Foucaultian. But my methodology, there's no need for such a complex approach as Cosso's middle range theory, as hermeneutics anymore. There's been a lot of work done on institutions since I did this. A lot of work in Australia on health institutions, on prisons, on orphanages. And I think I'm just going to end up with a quote from Graham Connor, because I think things have changed a lot since Graham Connor wrote in 1988 that hospitals have failed to attract much attention from historical archaeologists. So that's where I'm going to leave it, with a quote from Graham, and I think that brings it round in a nice circle. Two old guys talking about historical archaeology. And then I promised you a picture of my granddaughter right at the end. So there she is. This is Heidi. She's my daughter's daughter. And I don't care what anyone says, she is the most gorgeous granddaughter in the world. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you, Jon, very much. That was absolutely fabulous. And I didn't read your thesis. I skimmed over it at the weekend, and I was really, really impressed. So, and the fact that you had to justify so much, you had to push the boundary so much. We're all glad that you did, and that legacy that you leave by pushing the boundary, I mean, it's there. I think it shows in the attention that you've got with your talk tonight. So hopefully we'll hear more from you. So are there any questions? Has anyone got any questions? Or you can put them in the chat. You're getting lots of thank yous. Yes, people agree your granddaughter is gorgeous.
Excellent. That's what I want to hear.
And I'm sure she's spoilt rotten, isn't she?
Oh, no, of course not.
Yeah, so
Okay. Are there any questions?
any questions?
I mean, I don't have to answer any.
Oh, actually, Jules has asked, are you going to write a book?
Not to.
Are you going to write a book?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah, so when I first had this, when I first wrote this thesis, Chuck also asked me to turn it into a book, and I couldn't be bothered at the time, and I was trying to create a career and do a whole lot of other things. Yeah, I suppose I could if the right offer came along. It wouldn't take that much, I guess. So yeah, now that I'm free, and all I'm doing is travelling and jigsaws and mucking around with my granddaughter and supervising PhD students and such like, I probably have time to do it.
Yeah, so there's some more questions coming in. Maybe not a book. What about a screenplay version? Have you thought of that?
Thought of a novel. I thought of an archaeologist as a detective, finding skeletal material in dump one, and having to go back through the records and the archaeology and interview people and discover some kind of cover-up conspiracy that occurred at the Lazaret. So I had thought about that as a novel. Yeah, I've thought about that for a few years.
That'd be a good project. I tell you what, Gina and Siobhan are wondering what happened to the artifacts.
They all went back to the island.
Right.
So after I'd finished analysing them, I met with national parks and they all got transported back to the island. I don't know what's happened to them since they went back to the island. I left them all catalogued in the recreation hall.
Yeah, and you're getting a thank you here, not only for the talk, but a thank you from Robin Stocks saying your work really helped her understand archaeology of the female factory, asylum, and later institutions at Parramatta. So,
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Robin.
yeah. Now somebody's got their hand up.
Had his hand up.
Sorry?
I saw James had his hand up.
Oh, okay. James, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, thanks, John. For me, what was interesting about this talk was, you were talking about how much you would change if you were doing it again today, but actually for me, what was interesting was how current it all looks relative to, what hasn't really changed in what you would do in a PhD on a kind of total institution type site. So I wonder whether you could tell us a bit more about all the things that, still make sense all these years later, and what that says about sort of the strength of some of the ideas that you would have developed over the course of doing your thesis project.
Yeah, this is coming from someone who also wrote a thesis on the Lazaret.
Yeah.
I guess, like I said, my research questions wouldn't change because I said they wouldn't change because I'm still interested in them, but I think they wouldn't change because they're still relevant. And I think we've still got a long way to go to understand these sort of government and I guess religious institutions and how they operated, why they operated, the context within which they were operating. I mean, one thing I'd like to do, I guess, well, not anymore, but I would have liked to have done was to be more into the sort of political context within which the Lazaret occurred. In Queensland, for instance, in 1919, the Lazaret was the biggest Lazaret in Australia. It was also the only multiracial one. But Queensland also had the biggest mental health institution in Queensland, in Australia at that time. Woogaroo Asylum at Wacol, which still operates in a much, much smaller fashion with a different name. Woogaroo Asylum was the biggest mental health institution in Australia. And Queensland, and I guess other states as well, Western Australia has happened a lot in Western Australia, the use of offshore islands and that context of offshore islands, to understand that use where you basically dump unwanted people, the people that aren't defined as normal. And Moreton Bay had a prison on St Helena. It had the Lazaret. It had an inebriates asylum. It had a number of quarantine stations, and it had an Aboriginal mission, all on these islands in the bay, away from just the people of Brisbane. And I certainly know that in Western Australia, that was also a very common occurrence. So it would be good, I think, to try to understand those kinds of political motivations. They can't all just be down to like racism or concepts of pollution. So, trying to understand that kind of stuff. Yeah, Robben Island. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, and I was also thinking about Kalapapa on Molokai that you looked at, and that sort of struck me as being very much like Damon Island, where people were just basically dumped there and they had to make the best they could do out of what was there.
Yeah. Now, Jade, also picking up on that Western Australia, Jade, you can unmute yourself, or I can ask. She's wondering about whether you've looked at some way of memorialising part of the healing for the community on the island.
I just unmute if that's all right.
Yes, it's good.
Thanks, John. I was probably only a few years after you in doing some of your research, and like mine is nearly 25 years, to be honest, doing some of the work on the Burnie and Dorry Island lock hospitals, but I've obviously moved into other stuff in WA. And as part of that process, and I've moved away specifically from the archaeology, and by the way, your archaeology stuff is amazing and it echoes a lot of the stuff that's happened in WA, is that the communities are really wanting to look into the policies that you were just talking about that underpinned all of the decisions that have created some of the trauma and the potential socio-economic issues that have been caused as part of these removal of people to places. And some of the really amazing feedback and the community's wishes is the acknowledgement and the memorialisation of some of these places, which has really led to ongoing, I guess, healing for some of these community members that were sent to some of these incarcerated medical institutions. Does any look at any of that over there in Queensland?
I haven't personally, but the Friends of Peel Island have that community. There's a community organisation called the Friends of Peel Island, and they've done numerous sort of community activities there. They've had things like they take people to the island, community members to the island, and people write poetry based on their experience being within the Lazaret. So, they're not poets, but the idea is to write your feelings in poem form while you're there. And they've also published a number of pamphlets and booklets about the Lazaret. In terms of sort of community healing, there's actually, when June Bertelsen published her book on being a patient at the Lazaret, that actually caused quite a lot of angst for ex-staff from the Lazaret, because she wrote it from her perspective as a patient. And she was very angry at being sent to the Lazaret in the 50s and was very angry with the staff. And that anger comes through in the book and doesn't give the staff any credit for any kind of kindness or caring or nursing. So nursing staff who had worked on the island were quite horrified by June's book. And so there was quite a lot of angry correspondence associated with that. And because I actually did the launch of that book and somehow got involved in that correspondence. So I think the idea of healing for this community would be a really good thing to do. Yeah, I think it might be worth getting in contact with the Friends of Peel Island and seeing what if we can't work something out. So if you could if you could email me some things about what's been happening in Western Australia, that'd be great.
Yeah, and just to put a plug in, we've won state heritage awards in WA and lots of nominations globally for some of the work around the memorialisation up in Carnarvon for the Lock hospitals as well. So
Right.
it's pretty big achievement for that community.
Yeah, great, congratulations. And yeah, let me plagiarise some of it.
You've got to.
Okay, so there's Eleonora's got a question here asking whether anybody actually managed to test clear and return to the mainland during their lifetime there. And
Yeah.
also if there were any procedures in place to reintegrate them back into life on the mainland.
Okay, the answer to the second one's really easy. No, nothing. You were put on the steamer, chuffed back to Brisbane, up the Brisbane River, dropped off at the wharf at Brisbane, and left to your own devices. In terms of discharge, yes, there was a number of people. I think from my records, I created a patient admission record, a register. There wasn't one in the records at all, but I created one, and I think there was probably, from memory, low 70s people discharged and then readmitted. So the discharge rate would have been higher than that, because only half the patients died. So there was only about 250 burials on the island. So yeah, so there'd probably be something similar to that in terms of discharges. When the Lazaret closed in 1959, there was a handful of patients, like 12 or something left, and they were all transferred to the Princess Alexandra Hospital in South Brisbane, and were then treated as outpatients. So, and of course, that's what happens now. If you get Hansen's disease now, you're treated as an outpatient.
Okay. Do we have any more questions?
Thanks, Elle.
Yeah. There's some thank yous coming in. And honestly, it was amazing talk. Really, really interesting. And now we're just getting lots of thanks coming in, Jon. So I think you have to look at doing a book or a screenplay or a novel or all three.
Oh, yes. Okay, you were sure about a screenplay. Yeah.
A nice documentary.
Yeah, well, the kids show Totally Wild actually covered one of our excavation seasons. They were out on the island. I was interviewed by Ranger Stacey, and one of the highlights of my life. And so somewhere in the archives there's a episode of Totally Wild floating around about our excavations.
Oh, they didn't send you a copy?
Or they might have done, but it was probably in the days of VHS tape.
All right. Okay, those things can be put to, updated formats. Yeah.
I can't even find bloody CDs that I know I have. So,
Right. Okay. So look, that was really, really good. Fabulous talk. So, and